Today we are going to discuss the nature and significance of political theory. This is too vast an area to be finished in a course of one single lecture. And in fact, the very idea of political theory presumes that one should first clear oneself about any confusion regarding the word politics, since that is the root word in this collective noun political theory. Now, politics, in fact, or unfortunately, over its 2,500 years of history, has acquired too many meanings, too many interpretations, which ultimately may leave a student a bit confused. We may not know what we are talking about, or may refer to many things at one time when we use the word politics. To go into the root of the word politics, etymologically, it is derived from one Greek word, Politika. Aristotle wrote his book, which we have come to know as the Politics. In Greek, it was ta politika, politika meaning affairs of the state. And from Politika, around 1520s, we got an English rendering, politics, and it started circulating from that time onwards. Now, politika also came from another Greek word, which is the ultimate root word, that is polis. If I may spell it, P-O-L-I-S. Now, polis meant, in today's terminology, either a state or a larger political community presiding over a society. So, in fact, Aristotle has discussed the word or used the word politics mainly in the sense of state. In his time, the city-state. So, etymologically, the word politics has got linked up with the concept of state. Secondly, the term when it came into English around the middle of the 16th century was a time which we refer as the pre-democratic era of European politics. It's basically some or other form of monarchy in various European political units. Common people, common masses were not yet given access to the arena of politics, which came around, at least for the middle classes, around 1688 with the Glorious Revolution in England, and almost for everyone, for the really common people, with the storming down of the Bastille in 1789. And when common people entered politics, politics moved out of the royal court. And naturally, there started in the entire society many maneuvers of power at various levels to reach the actual seat of politics, the seat from where state power is controlled or state power is guided. But such activities might not have any direct link or might have had an indirect link with what we mean as by affairs of the state or running of the state and so on and so forth. Now, all this was ultimately linked up with the issue of politics, the running of the state. So, what we found that politics was spreading. Like if we throw a stone into a still pond, we see ripples spreading one after the other, the circles getting bigger and bigger in diameter. It is almost a similar phenomenon. Politics was getting spread throughout the society. Now, with that, with people being not so directly linked with statecraft, the running of the state, there's a question then, how do we define politics? So long, from its very inception, we have been equating politics with state, with running of the state, with statecraft and so on. Now, we find people not directly linked with statecraft, but they are doing politics, and politics is an activity in that sense. So, at that point, we came to a crossroad. We had to decide which way to go. Should we stick to the statecraft way of defining politics, or should we try to find out some of the alternatives? Interestingly, if we look into a dictionary, we'll always find, for example, in Collins English Dictionary, published as late as in 2003, politics was defined as a noun, the practice or the study of the art and science of forming, directing, and administering states and other political units. That definitely is a state-centered concept of politics. Though Collins English Dictionary is meant for everyone. Almost similar expression can be found across the Atlantic in American Heritage Dictionary of the English Language. There too, politics as noun was defined as the art or science of government or governing, especially the governing of a political entity such as a nation. Now, this is, I should say, that represents for so long which we mean by that state defines politics, or politics is defined by its linkage with state and statecraft. As I've been just talking about, we came to a crossroad that either we stick to the narrow state-centered definition or try to find out some other definition, some other way of looking at politics. As more and more politics was getting democratized, as more and more people were moving into the arena of politics, there's a need for getting out of the rut of state-centered definitions. And from that, we moved on to a different kind of definition, which is often called some kind of a, let's say, power-centered definition or functional definition in that sense. Now, that politics is about power, that idea is not something very new. That was exposed to us. We were exposed to that idea right in early 16th century by Niccolo Machiavelli, whom we often call the father of the power concept in politics. But from that time, though Machiavelli introduced the concept, perhaps he was a bit ahead of his times. And that's why he was so much criticized when he talked about a totally non-ethical concept of power being at the center of politics. But that is the truth in some way or the other. And after the French Revolution, after the first wave of democracy has hit European states around 18th century, we are trying to move out of the state-centered way and found our way or our new way of looking at politics in the concept of power, what people do while they do politics. At this point, I'll take help of a quotation from Andrew Haywood. Haywood, in his book entitled Politics, defines thus, I quote, "Politics in its broadest sense is the activity through which people make, preserve, and amend the general rules under which they live." Now, if you just go through the definition of politics, that it's an activity, first of all, we do politics. And secondly, through which people, and here is the element of democracy has been brought into the definition. People make, preserve, and amend the general rules under which they live. The totally people-centered definition of politics, identifying politics as a people's activity or activity which is spread through the society. Almost in the same vein, but with a slightly broader ambit. Another specialist in the field, Adrian Leftwich, has defined politics as thus, I quote, "Politics is at the heart of all collective social activity, formal and informal, public and private, in all human groups, institutions and societies." Perhaps, to me at least, this can be possibly the broadest possible definition of politics, which can include all aspects of it. Now, this leaves us with the problem of that how do we finally, we just can't say that we are being confused, we just can't say that we don't know which way to take. So we have to come to a conclusion in some respect or other. We have to come to some kind of a, I would say, ordering our thoughts about what is political science or what is politics about. Now, there have been 4 perspectives on politics, and from which we will ultimately see also that political science has also got its scope from that point. The 4 perspectives in politics. The first is politics as art of government, which we found in the 2 dictionary definitions in Collins and American Heritage. Second is politics as public affairs. We found that in Leftich's definition. Third is politics as compromise and consensus. An idea of it was reflected in Haywood's definition. And fourth and the last is politics as power and distribution of resources. That too can be found in both the definitions. Now, the first one, politics as the art of government, I don't think it needs much of a discussion. We have been talking about it almost since the days of Aristotle and till 19th or even early 20th century. Almost you can say that till the 40s or 50s of 20th century, the major strand of thought in political science and about political science was that political science and politics deals with government. There are definitions which have become cliches by now, as I'm not going to mention them, but I'm not being pejorative when I say cliches, but that is the fact that we have been conditioned to thinking that there is no politics beyond government. From 50s onwards, or let's say from 40s onwards, we found some turmoil going on in the intellectual field of political science, ultimately from which we got the behavioral revolution. And even before that, though we don't count him as a political scientist as such, in the mid-19th century there was Karl Marx. Now, both behavioral revolution and the earlier Marxist thought tried to bring politics out of the confines of government into the wide open society. And from there onwards, we get the idea that politics as public affairs, the second perspective. Now, what is public and what is private in that sense? Now, there is a broad definition, the broad distinction between public and private. Public meaning, there are 2 ways of looking at it, of course. One way, the more generally accepted, as public means the state and all its institutions, processes and laws. And private means refers to the entire civil society structure, including autonomous bodies, business groups, trade unions, so on and so forth. Now, anything politics concerns public affairs. Definitely not as narrow as state-centered, but anything connected directly or indirectly running of the state with the running of the government. We just can't think about totally watertight compartment into which the public and the private have been positioned. There is no high wall between the two. There is always a relationship, always a two-way traffic between the public and the private. We have been seeing that very recently also. Civil society impinging on policy making. But generally, we equate politics with the area we call as public life. But there is also another way of looking at it, where we think politics as even within the so-called private area, much broader, which we did find in Leftich's definition in all human groups, institutions and societies. So there can be politics inside a family also. And that brings us directly to the question of power. Now, if power be at the heart of politics, then any maneuver for power, any jockeying for power positions, any conflict, any compromise, that has power at its center objective, acquiring power, making my power much more than others, reducing the power of the other groups which are in contention with me, or other person which may be in contention with me. That happens at every possible level. So in that sense, there is no area of our life which can be strictly beyond politics, which can be strictly non-political. But that dilutes, in a way, that may be true, but that dilutes also the concern of our discipline of political science. And perhaps that had led David Easton to write in the International Encyclopedia of Social Science that, I quote, "Political science in the mid-20th century is a discipline in search of its identity." So we have left the straight and the narrow in the biblical language of state-centered definitions which held its sway for many centuries, we are trying to find out new ways and found our refuge in the concept of power, but that can really dilute our concern, which was reflected in perhaps this unfortunate statement of David Easton that even in the mid-20th century, this is a discipline in search of its identity. In lower classes, when people studies political science, maybe in the plus 2 levels or like that, in almost every textbook we find that UNESCO has defined the scope of political science. That political science subject should discuss these things also. Now, I am not sure about it, but to my knowledge, UNESCO has never given any such recommendation about any other subject of study except political science. That doesn't definitely add to our glory. So we are still looking for, in that sense, whether there can be a single way of defining politics, a single perspective on politics, but that is not going to happen, because we as individuals, we as social beings, individually and collectively do politics from our own standpoints, conditioned as we are by our own social settings, with our own needs and aspirations, with our own feelings and opinions. So politics is a very much living subject, very much living issue. It just can't be tied down to a single perspective or to a single definition. But the 4 perspectives I have just talked about can give us some idea about what to look for if we have to find out politics, if we have to understand politics. In fact, all 4 are correct, all 4 can be used, can be utilized, depending on the issue we are confronted with. We just can't say that 1 or 2 or 3 or 4, each one of them is the ideal one and others are not. And this confusion has been carried over naturally into political science. This multiplicity of views, this multi-hued nature of the term politics, this has been carried on into political science. Now, I am not going into the debate science or not. Political science is a subject that purports to study politics. Since politics itself can be looked up from 4 different perspectives, political science too can be laid down all these 4 ways, 4 paths, and that is reflected in the various academic concerns of political science, which we describe by a single word, the scope of a study in that sense. Now, political science for a long time, following the state-centered definition of politics, have been studying only state and its institutions, state and the government. Nothing else mattered to it. It did not go beyond the area of state. The history of politics is roughly paralleled in the history of political science, naturally. And with the introduction of democratic element into politics, and with the moving out of politics from the royal court into the common masses area of life. Political science too could not ignore things happening outside the narrow boundaries of state and its institutions. For example, with the rise of political parties in Europe, at least, which is the almost the foundational area of political parties around 19th century, they're constrained to study political parties. Later on, with the coming of associational groups, which you may call interest groups or pressure groups, they're also compelled to study interest groups and pressure groups, and they are not, by definition, by no way, linked directly or a part of the state and its institutions. So political science too was going beyond the state-centered perspective held for a long time. Now, at that point onwards, there came also the maybe from 1925 onwards, the first sapling we saw in 1925, which finally grew up into a big tree of a behavioral revolution, behavioral theories. We found a totally different way of looking at politics, taking society as a whole, as a system, and in fact, consciously not using the word state and replacing it with a word of much wider connotation, the political system. This is not the place, not the issue to discuss that in detail, but from 1950s onwards, as the system concept, as systems theories made explicit to us by David Easton and others, brought to us the focus entirely on entire society and how society and politics interact among themselves. So at this present point, those of us who study or try to understand political science has to look not only among the state and its institutions, its constitution, its body of laws, but also which we call non-governmental politics, politics happening beyond the immediate area of the government in larger societies, in which we call our daily lives, and might be even within families. To conclude the first discussion on this, since we are discussing political theory, or ultimately we'll be going into that area, now we find at the end of a discussion that politics carries a multiple of meanings. Each one may be correct, may be useful, may be of utility in different political situations. Political science too has a number of perspectives, number of approaches. We cannot ignore any one of them. We cannot say this is the best and these others are not to be used, and that too depends on the issue we are discussing. Now, this multiplicity, this multidimensionality, this multi-hued character of politics and political science got reflected in political theory as well, and we found, and we still find, a number of political theories which do differ fundamentally in their nature.